Every trip starts the same way for me. A quiet airport, a half-packed feeling, and this small moment where I wonder what I am actually looking for. Maybe it is not always about the destination. Maybe it is just about stepping out of routine long enough to feel life move again. So this is where the journey begins, Da Nang Airport, and our next stop, Bangkok, Thailand. And here we are, Bangkok. The last time I arrived here, I did what most tired travelers do. I opened Grab, booked a car, paid around $20, and then spent the last part of the ride barely moving. 10 minutes from the hotel, completely stuck in traffic for 2 hours. So this time, I wanted to do it differently. No car, no traffic roulette. Just me, my luggage, and the airport train into the city. I checked into my hotel, which I somehow did not film. So for the next couple of seconds, please imagine a perfectly average room, slightly overpriced, very air-conditioned, and lit like every hotel room at night. And then I found this cafe. Not because it was on the list, not because I planned it, but because Bangkok was so hot, the streets were loud, and air conditioning suddenly felt like a very good reason to stop. Later, I made what I thought was a wholesome decision. A corgi cafe. Tiny dogs, happy faces, a very reasonable activity. All the working corgis, officially introduced like tiny employees of the month. But as soon as I sat down, I understood the system. No snacks, no attention. Snacks, temporary affection. So, like everyone else, I bought a few extra treats. And suddenly, I became very interesting. Not loved, just useful. Basically, a snack vending machine with emotional needs. Give po, get paid. A simple business model, and honestly, very effective. think what I liked most about this trip was that it did not feel perfect. I did not see everything. I did not follow every plan. And there were definitely moments where I was just tired, hot, or looking for the nearest air-conditioned room. But that made it feel real, because travel is not always one beautiful scene after another. Sometimes it is figuring out the train, choosing a random cafe, getting lost for a moment, eating something simple, and realizing later that those small, unpolished parts are exactly what made the trip feel alive. So this was Bangkok. Not the full story, just my little version of it.